guys. We can get started now. So hello and welcome back. I hope everyone's having a good day so far. We're going to be talking about the third installment in Dubliners today, which is, of course, Araby. In particular, I want us to focus on this issue of epiphanies in the story, as well as in the other stories in the collection. So we'll get into all that and spend the period discussing it, trying to clear up the story. I think it's probably one of the most straightforward of the ones that we've read so far, in my opinion. And it's just another one of these examples of Joyce showing the scrupulous meanness of life, trying to faithfully recreate what ordinary existence is like, but showing how everyday mundane moments can have profound importance to the individuals experiencing them. So we'll talk about Araby. It's one of those stories. It's tricky. It seems like not a lot happens, but there's a lot going on and some connections to the other works that we've looked at. So tomorrow will be a writing day. I'll talk about final requirements, expectations for the paper, and then you'll just have the period to write. So if you haven't started, definitely start for homework, but no reading for tomorrow. The next story, Evelyn, will read in class on Monday. I'm not going to assign you work over the weekend either, so you can focus on finishing this essay, which is due at the end of the school day on Monday. What else? Oh yeah, I have a public service announcement from the library that I want to share with you. As I'm opening this, anyone have any questions for me? Okay, so the library is running a March Madness program in March. This one is a competition between some graphic novels. You're all welcome. Everyone in the school is welcome to check some of these books out and vote for your favorite. There'll be a few elimination rounds before the best one is selected. So the first round has eight graphic novels, and voting's you can vote up through March 26th. So they're going to narrow it down to from the 8 to the top, or to the next 4, and they'll continue to narrow it down from there. So you can get these books in physical form at the library. They're also available electronically if you want to download a copy or borrow one from the school website. They're available, and the librarians pick them out as books that kids have liked, or pretty highly acclaimed, and might be of interest to you. If you've never read a graphic novel before, it's basically a comic book, but a bit more extensive and involved. It's an interesting genre, and people have been doing a lot of cool stuff with them in recent years. So I think they're worth checking out. You can read them, one or more. If you like it, cast a ballot, and if you cast a ballot, then you'll be entered into a drawing to win some prize. Not quite sure what the prize is, but win it and then we'll find out. I'll post this online. You could take a look at all the books available and summaries of them as well. So if any of you are interested, I'd encourage you to check out one of these books. If you want more information, you could talk to Mrs. Bicker in the library or me, and I can try to answer your questions. Okay. So that's that. And let's get back to Araby. So before I ask you to share your impressions of the story, I want to talk about this idea of epiphanies. And that's a word that I've already brought up in class when we were doing our signpost worksheet. That was one of the signposts, an epiphany. So you should know it from that. But just in case you need a refresher, could someone tell us what is an epiphany? Maybe for you, like how would you define it, and maybe even an example of one from fiction or even from your life? What's an epiphany? Good, a sudden realization. It's kind of this lightning flash of knowledge. So an epiphany is always abrupt, and some event will set it off in your life. Um, and For Joyce, it often came about in the mundane, ordinary, kind of boring moments of existence. So the history of the word epiphany is connected to religion. It initially was about religious revelations that people had. Joyce was actually the first person to take it out of that religious connotation and use it in an everyday sense. So if you've been hanging out with your friends and said, "Hey, I just had this epiphany," you could kind of thank James Joyce for that. He used it in a literary sense, and then it kind of spread throughout the culture. But for him, these were crucial moments, and he wanted in his writing to capture epiphanies. He called them sudden spiritual manifestations. Manifestation is when something comes into existence. So the sudden moment where there's a profound spiritual sort of knowledge that's gained. And he called them the most delicate and evanescent passing of moments. So it was his job to identify these and capture them in stories because he saw them as so important. So we can look back at the stories of Dubliners as stories about epiphanies. That's true of the ones we've read so far and the ones that we will read. Perhaps Araby has the clearest example of an epiphany, though. So let's think back to the sisters, the first story we read. Think back to the boy who was the main character. What was his epiphany in the sisters? Either raise your hand or write it in the chat. What does that boy suddenly realize? And by the way, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer here. James Joyce did not write a study guide along with this that he put at the end of the book. He didn't have anything absolutely in mind. So as long as you could defend your answer, it's valid. But what do you think? What's the realization that he has? That the priest is, reading in the chat now, the priest is dead, the boy doesn't feel grief towards it, only feels freedom. Okay, yeah, that's definitely one view. Maybe the realization is he's better off now that he's free from the influence of the priest, and maybe even that's a good thing because the priest doesn't seem to have been that great of a guy. Good. Colin, what about for you?
When he realizes the priest is dead as well, because epiphanies aren't specifically like a good revelation. For all you know, it could be something that you're trying to deny and trying to say, no, this is not true. Like you refuse to accept it, because that's one of the possibilities of epiphany.
Yeah, that's a good point of clarification. So you could say his epiphany is just a realization of mortality. My mentor is dead, and feeling the weight of that. It's one thing to intellectually know that everyone's going to die. It's another thing to kind of feel that in your bones. So we see that at the end of the story for sure. What about with an encounter? Story we talked about yesterday. That one's a little more straightforward. What's the epiphany that the main character has at the end of the story? What does he realize about adventure? Norman?
Well, he realized that adventure can be dangerous.
Good. I'm not going to let you off the hook that easily. Could you elaborate a little?
Uh,
Like, how does he realize that?
well, he starts off, I don't remember his exact quote, but it was something about being excited to go on an adventure because he gets to, be free. And then he realizes with this freedom, very strange things can happen and dangerous. Uh, there's hazard involved with adventures. It's not just all, courage and everything going your way. Things can go the wrong way.
Yeah, well put. It's an idealized version of adventure that contrasts with the gritty reality of what adventure entails. He thinks that adventure is going to be maybe exciting, but not really dangerous, something like the stories that he reads about the Wild West. In reality, adventure is uncomfortable, vaguely dangerous, unsettling. He doesn't really like it. And that's not to say that he should have stayed at home, but it does say that his idealized view of the world comes crashing down. So the epiphany is his realization of how the world actually is, and it doesn't live up to his childish imagination. So as we go through Araby, think about what's the epiphany, what does he realize? And then of course we'll also connect it back to that larger theme of paralysis that we've been talking about throughout the book. So first let me ask you about your general thoughts about Araby. What did you think? What stood out to you? Any lines you found interesting, parts you found interesting, thoughts about what it means? What say you guys? Okay, Colin, what did you think?
You're well before it, but you're like having internet issues for me. Like,
Oh, okay.
so something might have to go. Just looking to resolve, but it just was interesting to me how like he is doing something for someone, and then he has that really big epiphany at the end of like, oh my goodness, I'm a horrible person kind of a thing. Like, it's just interesting how it's like the mood just like it's like this like in like older movies where they have the piano like the use piano music and it's just like it's
Yeah.
just like that kind of feeling for me, like the sudden stop.
Yeah, it is pretty sudden. He walks into Araby and kind of sense that things aren't what he expected it to be, and then pretty suddenly reality again, punches him right in the face. Yeah, good. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, let's look at the beginning of it, and we'll just go through to see how the boy arrives at this epiphany. Oh, Norm, you have a thought?
Yeah, I just wanted to say for me, this is the first time I've ever seen that there can be a negative epiphany for characters, not just positive.
Yeah, I mean, you considered the boy's epiphany an encounter to be positive?
I mean, obviously he's learning more, but it was kind of negative for him because it was a dangerous, scary situation.
Yeah, I mean the Araby epiphany is definitely unpleasant. It's a harsh, bitter realization. But any kind of epiphany, if it's true, is good in the sense that it helps you grow as a person. So I guess you could look at the silver lining that way. But yeah, the Araby is a much more devastating story emotionally for the main character. So let's talk about the initial setting here of the story. We know all these stories take place in Dublin, and Joyce's view of Dublin is kind of a drab place. So just the first sentence starts us off. North Richmond Street, being blind, was a quiet street, except at the hour when the Christian Brothers School set the boys free. Just something kind of interesting. North Richmond Street, it's not a coincidence that this story takes place here. That's where Joyce lived and grew up when he was in Dublin. And Christian Brothers School is the school that he went to. So he's kind of subtly inserting his childhood into the story about childhood. He says, an uninhabited house of 2 stories stood at the blind end detached from its neighbors in a square ground. And so he calls the street blind. Basically, that just means that it's a one-way cul-de-sac. So like that's it. There's an end to it. But also the blindness that's brought up kind of reflects the main character's inability to see clearly about his relationship or his hopeful relationship. And then the houses there are lined up with brown, imperturbable faces, imperturbable, unable to be perturbed or bothered, kind of like faces in a row that are just really stern. So this is a kind of dreary, somber sort of neighborhood, but that contrasts with the kids who are outside playing. Also, you might have found this paragraph interesting because we see some connections here with the first story. So this boy's in a house. The former tenant of the house was a priest who died in the back drawing room. That might sound familiar. In his will, he left the house to his sister. So we might be thinking of the sisters here. Is this the same house that the sisters took place in? Maybe. Maybe it's just Joyce messing with us, but there are some connections here. Also, Walter Scott, that was the author, one of the authors mentioned in the last story. So there are these like subtle parallels that Joyce is making. So it's winter, the boys are playing outside, and our main character becomes infatuated with Mangan's sister. Mangan is his friend, and he's just caught up with Mangan's sister. Interestingly, we never actually find out her name. She's just Mangan's sister. What do you make of that? It would have been pretty easy for Joyce to just come up with some girl's name and use that. So he very deliberately leaves her name out of it. Why? How does that change how we think about her? Deja.
I think that brings up kind of what you were saying before, how he keeps mentioning that the street is blind. There's so much blind imagery that it's almost like he has rose-colored glasses. That he's so infatuated with the idea of this girl that he doesn't even know her name because he is just so blinded by what he perceives to be such a real feeling of love that he can't even bother to sit there and say, oh, yeah, Mangan's sister has a name, and her name's
definitely
Kimberly.
her real name. Kimberly. Seems like Kimberly. Good. Colin, you had your hand up briefly. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's also, I'd say, adds to the story as it progresses because it gives her like a mysterious air, like a kind of like a mysterious feeling to her character, and it's also like a nod to what Deja said. It also, with the ending, how it is, it like how you're as a horrible person that also could possibly be roped into that as well.
Mm-hmm. Good, yeah. I mean, what we'll see throughout this story is he's putting her on a pedestal, right? He's not really in love with Kimberly. He's in love with this idealized kind of fantasy version of this girl who he's never even really talked to. But it's a sort of inauthentic attraction. Like, how can you really love someone if you don't know anything about them? If you don't know their personality, their interests, their likes, their dislikes, their little quirks, and you know how they feel. Like, that's not a real relationship. That's just, I don't know, delusion. So that's I think an important part of this story. And we get to see his first reaction to her, and we'll dig into this a little more deeply. Wherever he goes, her image seems to follow. So let me read this section for you here. I'll read this whole paragraph. Okay, as I read this, consider there's a contrast that's established in this paragraph. What is the contrast between, and what's the purpose of that contrast? And how does the boy kind of envision himself? Her image accompanied me in places the most hostile to romance. On Saturday evenings, when my aunt went marketing and shopping, I had to go carry some of the parcels. We walked through the flaring streets, jostled by drunken men and bargaining women, amid the curses of laborers, the shrill litanies of shop boys who stood on guard, by the barrels of pigs' cheeks, the nasal chanting of street singers who sang Come All You about O'Donovan Rosa, politician, or a ballad about the troubles in our native land. These noises converged in a single sensation of life for me. I imagined that I bore my chalice safely through a throng of foes. Her name sprang to my lips at moments in strange prayers and praises, which I myself did not understand. My eyes were often full of tears, I could not tell why, and at times a flood from my heart seemed to pour itself out into my bosom. I thought little of the future, did not know whether I would ever speak to her or not, or if I spoke to her, how I could tell her of my confused adoration. But my body was like a harp, and her words and gestures were like fingers running upon the wires. It's a really nice last line, by the way. So what's the scene here? What's the contrast? There's a hint. Part of the contrast has to do with setting and the character. Okay, well, why don't we just do the first half? So when he's out in the market, how is this market described? How are the streets described? Yeah, Norman, thanks. How are they described?
A hostile environment with drunk people and people who are cursing.
Good, yeah, it's not really a pleasant place. It's kind of gritty and seedy. The flaring streets, so we're on the pavement in kind of reality here, right? And it's kind of dark and edgy. There are drunk people bargaining women, maybe that means prostitutes, cursing, shop boys selling things, barrels of pig cheeks, people singing, people talking about all the problems in their country. So it's a pretty down to earth, unpleasant, gritty kind of place. And that contrasts with the boy and how he thinks of himself. So how does he think of himself amid all of this ugliness? What do you think, Colin?
I think something resembling like angelic, like something like pure, like none of that really touched him. None of he's above it all, kind of.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, that none of it touched him, that he's above it. He does see himself as kind of separate. There's the unwashed crowd over here, and here he is on this kind of with this higher purpose. He says, I imagine that I bore my chalice safely through the throng of foes. And we might see that word chalice there and be reminded of the sisters, right? That's another connection. And so he's seeing himself. Here's my chalice prop. It's kind of carrying this holy relic through the unwashed masses. You might be reminded here of stories of King Arthur as well. And I think this is what the boy has in mind. So there are stories of the Holy Grail, knights hunting the Holy Grail. If any of you have seen the third Indiana Jones movie, you know what I'm talking about. And these are just like stories from the Middle Ages that the pure knight would go off, go to a distant land, face danger, face the sinful, come back victorious with some important object. And that's kind of how the boy is imagining him here. I mean, in reality, he's just some kid at the market, but in his head, things are much grander than that. Okay. We see this idea continue on with a description of Bang and sister and the first time they talk together. Okay. So here's their first and only conversation, and we only get his side of it. As always, Joyce is leaving a lot out. So what can we infer about how she feels about him from this? Okay, I'll read it again. At last she spoke to me. When she addressed the first words to me, I was so confused, I did not know what to answer. She asked me, was I going to Araby? I forgot whether I answered yes or no. It would be a splendid bazaar, she said. She would love to go. And why can't you? I asked. While she spoke, she turned a silver bracelet around and around her wrist. She could not go, she said, because there would be a retreat that week in her convent. Her brother and two other boys were fighting for their caps, and I was alone on the railing. She held one of the spikes, bowing her head towards me. The light from the lamp opposite our door caught the white curve of her neck, lit up her hair that rested there, and, falling, lit up the hand upon the railing. It fell over one side of her dress and caught the white border of a petticoat, just visible as she stood at ease. It's well for you, she said. If I go, I said, I will bring you something. So this is the call to adventure for him for this kind of mock quest that he's going to go on. He's on this journey to find her some treasure, some trinket that he can buy, bring back to her, and she, in his mind, she's going to say, "Oh, great, you bought me a gift. Awesome, I'll be your girlfriend now." Right? But if we're careful reading this, what might we be able to tell about how she feels about him? Yes, Colin.
I would say it's a mixture of disinterest and a bit of nerve, anxiety, and maybe even some resemblance of maybe like a shy like kind of mutual, but she doesn't know how to, she doesn't, because she she said that she like seems like kind of not exactly jealous, but she seems like she's nervous around him, which like there have been like common things that I've seen with for love things, like there's the side character that eventually does end up marrying the main character or whatever. It ends up being like a side thing, like the other one's like normally very shy, very soft spoken, and this is kind of the impression I'm getting from that.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah, I like that you pick up about the nervousness. Like she's playing with the bracelet, twirling it around. That does suggest to me discomfort. And look at how much they talk. They only say 3 lines to each other. This is not a very deep relationship. They're not chummy. And there's nothing here that indicates that she has the faintest interest in him. If anything, it seems like she's just being polite. Here's my neighbor. He's standing here. Let me say a few things to fill up the awkward silence. Oh, yeah, did you hear about this bazaar that came to town? Yeah, sounds cool. All right, see you later. And then she's gone, and that's it. So, I mean, he reads this as a good sign, but we might look at it and be suspicious of that. Also, there's a lovely description of her. How does she look here in the light? How does she appear to him? Right, especially with this line here. How is she physically described? I mean, think about movies you might have seen where an actress comes on the set and then there's some light behind her and it's shining directly behind her head and there gives it this kind of glowing border. She almost looks angelic or pure, or literally glowing. And so, you know, furthermore, in his head, he's on a pedestal. She's pure. She's more than just some neighboring girl. Okay. The story goes on. We find out, you know, he lives with his aunt and uncle, another connection to the sisters, and he's waiting for his uncle to come home so he can go to Araby. Finally, he arrives, he comes back drunk, gives him money, and then the boy goes to Araby. So I mentioned yesterday that Araby, the word, was a shorthand for Arabia. That was just an old term for it. So this market is titled Araby, Arabia, and it's supposed to be like a marketing gimmick. It's supposed to sound like this exotic, far-off place, and you'll go there and see all these wonderful things that you could only get in another world, right? He goes there, and what's it like for him, right? What does the place actually look like? It's comes up in this paragraph. Oh, sorry, wrong paragraph. Yeah, this one. Yeah, Ava.
I would say it's very like abandoned and kind of like a ghost town.
Yeah, exactly. It's empty. He's too late, right? He missed his opportunity. Everyone's just packing up now. And also, it's not some grand exotic place. This is like a building with some empty tables in it. It's kind of dark. There are some people counting money, right? It's not Araby. That's just something they use to sell more trinkets. So this is the first time we see those, the realization that his fantasies are kind of crashing down. Yet there's still more of that religious imagery, right? There's a silence like that which pervades a church. He still sees himself on this holy quest, but he's starting to get to that epiphany. And for me, I think this is where the epiphany occurs. So when he overhears this conversation. So there's this young girl who's working a stall, selling some stuff, and then there are two young guys with her, and the three of them are talking. This is their conversation, right? And it's a weird conversation, but I think it's important. They say, "Oh, I never said such a thing." "Oh, but you didn't." "Oh, but I didn't." "Didn't she say that?" "Yes, I heard her." "Oh, there's a fib." It's like they're talking about nothing. Like it's just back and forth blather. They're just saying things for the sake of saying things. But the boy hears this. The young lady comes over, is like, "Do you want anything?" She's kind of grumpy. And he says, "No, thank you." He came all this way, built it up in his head so much, and then he's just not going to buy anything. So why not? What do you think he realized from overhearing this conversation? And it's not so much what is said as it is who is saying it and how they're saying it. So imagine you're this kid. In your mind, what it means to have a girlfriend is you're going to go on a holy quest and you're like a knight and she's your damsel and you're going to win her some lofty prize and come back in all your glory, and this woman who you've never met will then get married to you, and everything will be perfect. And then in contrast to that, what's this? No, we're having a hard time with this one. Well, like, what are they doing? It's just some girl, couple guys, they're talking, they're laughing, sounds like they're being flirtatious. And he's seeing like what do guys and girls talk about like when they're just like flirting? What's an actual kind of start to a relationship like? Just like casual conversation, and what they say and do isn't really as important as the emotions behind it. The words are just there as like filler. The important thing is that they're talking. And he sees this and he's like, oh, wait, is that like how you're supposed to get a girl's attention? Is like that what it looks like when a girl's interested in you? And he finally starts to dawn on him, wait, that's not how Mangan's sister was talking to me. Oh. I think that's where the statue of Mangan's sister starts to fall off the pedestal, you know. And he says, no, thank you. He leaves. So here we see, again, that moment of paralysis. He has his opportunity to buy the trinket. That's why he came here. He can't do it. He's paralyzed. He just leaves instead. Okay. And the story ends with him gazing up into the darkness. I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger. As Araby closes, he goes home unsuccessful. So what is his epiphany? What has he realized about himself? Yeah, Deja.
On top of kind of realizing that he was an extremely creepy person who was pushing himself onto poor Kimberly,
Yeah.
he also realizes that he's not above everybody else. He's really, really shallow. And he was sitting there and he was driven by this idea of her that he didn't care to get to know her and actually see if she liked him. And he didn't care what was going on around him because it couldn't touch him. He was too good for it. But now he's so angry at himself for realizing, yeah, I'm a crap person
Yeah,
and
wow,
I
that
need
was the
to fix
harshest takedown of this narrator I've ever heard, but it's probably not unwarranted. Good, yeah. He realizes this has all been in my head. And I think the operative word in this last line is vanity, right? And there are two levels to this, right? Two definitions of vanity at work. There's vanity in terms of pride. Like Deja pointed out, he thinks of himself as superior, as a holy knight, pure knight on a quest to prove his worth. It's like, you're not better than everyone else, you're just some kid, right? That's not like love isn't like what it is in the stories. It's more complex than that, but also simpler in some ways. And he's also vain in the sense that he's unsuccessful. Went on this whole quest for nothing. He's failed his quest, but what he's come with is a greater understanding of himself as just some kid. So the realization is more of those illusions about childhood, childish illusions tumbling down and seeing clearly the adult world and the gritty reality of it. So hopefully that clears up Araby. It's one of those stories where, again, kind of a non-event, really nothing much happens, but for the boy, this is a profound moment that I'm sure he'll remember forever. So any other thoughts, questions, things you noticed about Araby? Anything else to say before we wrap things up? Okay, well then we could stop there. So again, tomorrow we'll work on the book club essay. No reading for tonight. We'll read the next story next week. And also a week from today will be your quiz on Dubliners. We're going to read 2 more stories. That quiz will ask you to compare and contrast 2 of the stories that we've read. So just keep that in mind.